It's lovely to see you all here again. Thank you very much for taking time out of your very busy schedules to come and join us for this Audit and Risk Committee Chair's briefing. We acknowledge this land that we meet on today as the traditional lands for the Kaurna people and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Adelaide region and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. We also pay respects to the cultural authority of Aboriginal people visiting or attending from other areas of South Australia or Australia. So we've got a fairly hectic agenda for today, as you can see from that. Before I turn to our first speaker, Sarah Witcher, I'd just like to sort of, as I draw to the end of this second year as Auditor-General, I want to share some of our achievements and challenges for the last year. We've got Daniel, Salve and Andrew coming up, and I don't really want to steal their thunder, but I will talk briefly about some of the things that we found and highlight some things that are in this year's annual report, as well as addressing the ongoing challenge of actioning the controls observations we make in that report. And also I want to talk about a strategic opportunity that I see to improve transparency and oversight in South Australia. As I said, it really 2025 has been a year, I think, for us that I'm very proud of. It's a year of significant achievements. We've conducted again over 160 public authority audits with everything that goes along with that. Independent audit reports, engagement letters, audit management letters. In those audit management letters, we identified over 600 audit findings. We released what I think were some very important performance audit reports, in particularly the report on proton therapy and the issues around governance with that project. We identified a number of improvement opportunities for contract management in local government through our local government work. And in particular, what I would draw your attention to is the findings in local government very much mirror the sort of findings we see in state government. So if you're interested in looking at insights for improving contract management, that report's a fantastic report. And of course, we've got our state finances report, which will be coming out, I think, next week. So we'll be tabling that in Parliament next week. Another area that we're very proud of this year is the development of our Insights tab on our website. This is a tab that's available to everybody, but particularly focused at members of audit and risk committees and agency executives. It provides another medium to highlight the work we do and the opportunities for improvement that exist across government. It hasn't been a year without challenges. We've continued to experience significant staff turnover and importantly, or troublingly, staff turnover in our professional audit staff and our middle level audit staff. So turnover of over 30%. What that means is it's increasingly hard for us to put skilled and experienced people into our financial audits. But it's the flip side of that, and the opportunity for us has been, it's been a great opportunity to bring on some really young, excitingly smart staff who we're training up as fast as we can to go into those audits. So we onboarded 47 new staff during the year. So out of a group of around 120 heads, that's a significant number. We managed our budget under increasing resourcing pressures. So we've got a set amount of work we have to do, and we have to do it within a set budget. We don't use our audit fees to fund ourselves, they go straight to the government. So what the government gives us as appropriation is what we've got, and we have to live within it. So for last year, unfortunately, we overspent our budget, which is a shameful thing for an Auditor-General to say. We overspent our budget by about $300,000. If we don't get any support from the government this year, we'll probably overspend by about $750,000. We've got the emerging challenges, and I'll talk about this further in a minute, of AI as both an audit tool and increasingly seeing AI embedded into agency processes, and of course the need for us to audit those processes. And unfortunately, we've continued to be challenged at lower levels in agencies in our interactions in seeking information to support our audits. So increasingly there's a culture in agencies that somehow we're out to get them, notwithstanding that we pitch quite a different approach, and that everything should be done to hold off giving us the information we need to conduct our audits, which ultimately makes it worse for the agencies and worse for us. Now, it's not all agencies, but it is a culture we continue to see growing, one that we're continuing to try and address, and we'll certainly be doing training through the current year in the way we interact with agencies. But it's also something that can be, I'm talking with CEs about, and it's something that audit committees can also talk to their staff or their management about. Part A of this year's annual report included some important lessons around artificial intelligence. We see it as a growing opportunity for government, but also a risk. Whether it's, we continue to see social media and media discussion around AI almost every day, whether it's the Big Four spruiking 30% staff reductions as they adopt AI technology to do their audits, or stories about data risks through the use of AI tools, or, as we've seen locally, the use of incorrect or false data sourced from AI and inappropriately using that as authority for legal cases and other matters. So in the lead up to the audit, we surveyed 23 major agencies, and we were particularly interested in what their current use of AI was, what their plans for using AI, and particularly what their governance and how they use AI for decision making. Andrew Corrigan will talk some more about this, so I'm not going to steal all of his thunder, but I would encourage you to take a look at the 4 or so pages that are in Part A of my report for this year. They provide some really useful snapshots of what sort of governance agencies should have in place, and I think some indications of the sort of questions that audit and risk committees and management should be asking about the use of AI within their agencies. I think every time I've come up here over the last 2 years, I've had something to say about repeat findings and the things that we find in our audits that we convey to agencies and that they continue to flow on from year to year. Our audit findings are a key output from our audits, and an important consideration for ARCs is our management letter and the control or improvement opportunities they identify. As I said before, our 24-25 audits identified over 600 control issues with the risks assessed by us. Happily, there's no extreme risks in the list this year, but there are plenty of high risks, and these high risks are how we assess them as being the control weaknesses that may cause major disruption to process objectives and legislative compliance, or a likely material misstatement. We advocate for those high risks that there should be intervention within 2 months and a detailed action plan put together. Similarly, for medium, we talk about moderate disruption and intervention within 3 to 6 months. The fact that a large number of these risks flow on from year to year is of significant concern to me. So as I said, we had 642 issues identified in the last year, 58 high, 378 medium and 206 low. In the repeat, there were 286 repeat issues, 27 high and 177 medium. So if you follow what we advocate for in our risk assessment, those 286 issues should have been addressed within the year. They certainly should have plans for being addressed. Now, I accept that that's our risk assessment, and we do talk to agencies about those risk assessments, and we take their feedback. So I would argue that on the whole, there's some agreement about the nature of those risks. So the question is, if we're assessing them as needing that level of attention, there must be something that's impeding them being addressed. And I accept that for some of them, it'll be resource implications or things that just can't be changed within the agency. So I suppose what I'm advocating for audit and risk committees is some more in-depth discussion about those control findings and the risks. Audit and risk committees should be challenging management to understand the agency business context around those risks. And where the risk can't be addressed directly, what compensating controls does the agency have in place to ensure that the issue that's been identified by audit is being appropriately managed? And ultimately, are the agencies drawing up action plans for each of those risks? And is there clear accountability for who's going to do it? There's also clearly a role there for internal audit in following through on all of those risks that we've identified. So discussion about audit findings and follow-up, I think, is a great segue into a broader discussion on my role and the role of parliamentary oversight. The work that I've been doing in 2025 has really presented two opportunities for me to step back and have a more strategic look at where the role of the Auditor-General sits within the oversight framework in South Australia. Particularly, done a lot of work this year liaising with Treasury and Finance on their Public Finance and Audit Act review that they were required to do under the Act. Andrew Richardson, my predecessor, did a lot of work in identifying opportunities to improve independence and effectiveness of the Auditor-General's office. And the other piece of work that's been going on is some work with Deakin. So Deakin University have been doing some work for the Australian Council of Auditors-General to update work on benchmarking the independence of Auditor-General's offices across Australasia, including Fiji, Papua New Guinea and New Zealand. Both exercises have highlighted the importance of a formal relationship between Parliament and the Auditor-General. And the reality is South Australia lacks that formal relationship. Do tell, they say. So South Australia doesn't have a properly constituted Public Accounts Committee. Back in 1991, I believe it was, the Public Accounts Committee Act was repealed and the Public Accounts Committee was replaced with what we have now as an Economic and Finance Committee. The Economic and Finance Committee doesn't have a formal relationship with the Auditor-General. It has a broad mandate that allows it to look at audit matters among a lot of other economic and finance type matters, but it doesn't have a formal relationship. Contrast that to every other jurisdiction in Australia and in fact across the Asia Pacific, as far as I'm aware. They have formal relationships. A properly constituted Public Accounts Committee with a formal relationship with the Auditor-General, a requirement for that committee to review all the reports that are produced and unpack the issues in those reports. As it stands at the moment, the Economic and Finance Committee and the Budget and Finance Committee meet with the Auditor-General's office once a year, usually in November and December. They try and sneak it in before the year ends. And it's not a targeted look at anything in particular in the reports. It's really an opportunity to unpack political issues that they may find in the reports. Whereas a properly constituted Public Accounts Committee doesn't question policy choices. It focuses on administrative choices and cost-effective policy implementation and achieving desired results. Even the highest quality audit reports may not be acted upon if considered by Parliament through an appropriate lens, through a PAC or similar. Just to close out on that bit, the Deakin review, which will be released early next year, will show South Australia sitting at the bottom of the league table in terms of independence of Auditor-Generals across the Asia Pacific, just above the Northern Territory and Papua New Guinea. I'm not sure that's a great situation, something to be particularly proud of. So the advantages I see of a Public Accounts Committee, and to be fair, some of my colleagues interstate say be careful what you wish for. You want a relationship with the Public Accounts Committee, those guys spend, probably a day a month talking to their Public Accounts Committees. I actually see that as a good thing, an opportunity to unpack the great work that my guys do and lead to better conversations about improving the transparency of government. Accountability drives corrective action. It drives improved government, and ultimately it improves public trust. The relationship between PACs and the Auditor-General is not just procedural, it is foundational to good governance. Working together, they can safeguard public resources and uphold democratic accountability. I thank you for listening to that. I know there's not one person in this room that can actually change things particularly, but it's a story and a discussion I want to increasingly have, because I think it's a genuine opportunity to change the nature of discussion we have with the public and with the Parliament, and ultimately to improve the way government runs in South Australia. Back in 2023, just before I started, one of Andrew Richardson's last reports was the Climate Change Risk Management Report. That report highlighted the importance of effective central coordination and monitoring in establishing sound climate change risk management arrangements. At the time of our report and those findings, the then acting CE of DEW, Ben Bruce, is now the CE, acknowledged the start of an important transformation for DEW and the government as a whole to manage climate change risk. It's great to have Sarah with us today, and she's going to talk to us about the great work that DEW have been doing in progressing those recommendations and what it means for agencies. I'll be back at the end of the presentation to take questions, but at the moment I'd like to hand over to Sarah, who's going to talk to us about climate change risk management. Thank you.
How do I drive?
Just press the space bar. That's actually what I go for because it's the biggest one.
Even I can see it. Fantastic. Thanks, Andrew, and thanks everyone for having me here today to talk about climate risk management with you all. My name is Sarah Witcher and I'm the team leader of the Climate Change Risk and Adaptation Policy team within the Department for Environment and Water. And we are leading the rollout of the Climate Ready Government initiative across the South Australian public sector. So I'd just like to also acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Kaurna people and pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging, but also really acknowledge the role that First Nations people have played in managing country through many thousands of years of changing climate and the knowledge and experience that we have to learn from them that can help us as we move through our current journey in dealing with climate change. So why are we embedding climate action? And as Andrew helpfully segued, the 2023 report of the Auditor-General highlighted that climate change is a known risk that could have catastrophic impacts for the South Australian government. And I'm sure you don't hear it too often, Andrew, but that was a very welcome report on our behalf. And the Department for Environment and Water, really appreciates the work of the Auditor-General to help support as we move through our work in helping public sector agencies to start managing climate risk in a more sort of centralised way. But we also want to acknowledge that there's two sides to dealing with climate change. Often it's all about the doom and gloom, the risk, but there's also opportunity and there's real upside as recognised in our state's economic statement as well. But we do acknowledge that we are facing a crisis and this is forecast to only get worse. Climate change is challenging because it's incremental. It's a bit like the frog in the boiling pot, or in this case, the extreme weather event. In South Australia, we are here, we're very used to dealing with extreme weather events and it tends to be a bit, another drought, another flood. We've done this before, we can do it again. So it can be a little bit easy to dismiss. But we are seeing already the economic and social impacts of these increasing extreme weather events, whether it's financial assistance from government, concerns about insurance costs and availability, pressure on water resources. This year alone, we've obviously seen drought, floods, and of course the algal bloom affecting different parts of the state at the same time. Climate change is also transforming governance and government operating and legal environments through community expectations, standards for climate-related financial disclosures, and increasing climate-related litigation. However, humans are resilient and we can respond and adapt. And if we do this well in SA, there are significant opportunities, not only things like economic growth through low emissions technologies and industry development, but also things like improving public health through low emissions vehicles, increased active transport, and reduced costs through more resilient infrastructure and service provision. And of course, the elephant in the room, if Adelaide is successful in its bid to host COP31, there will obviously be significant attention and focus on what South Australia is doing and how we are responding to climate change. So I understand my colleagues from the climate science team have spoken to this group previously, so I won't spend too long on this slide. But suffice to say, projections indicate that South Australia's climate will get hotter, drier, and more unpredictable over the next 25 years. We have already seen 1.1 degrees of warming above pre-industrial temperatures, and it's seeing increasing concern that we are coming up against some pretty significant tipping points that will dramatically accelerate the rate of climate change. Now, 1.1 degrees might not sound like much, but as many of you may have seen, the recent National Climate Change Risk Assessment found that we are already being impacted by climate change in all areas of government, the economy, and society. It also included things like estimates of over $4 billion losses to South Australia's economy from fires and storms alone yearly by 2050. More than 20,000 residential buildings at very high risk from sea level rise by 2090. And the number of severe heatwave days increasing from around 3 days a year now to around 10 days per year. And currently, when there is an extreme heatwave, ambulance call-outs increase by about 8%, and mortality increases by around 328 people in SA. So you can imagine what the impacts of that increase are going to be. And to give you an indication of our recent impacts to the state government, bushfire recovery support in 2019-20 contributed to the budget deficit that we experienced that year. And the combined cost of the River Murray flood recovery, the 2024-25 drought, and the 2019 bushfires was over $370 million to government alone. So why climate ready government? In a government context, it's important to recognise that embedding climate considerations is more than just an environmental problem, or due diligence for that matter. There is a risk and opportunity premium. It will help minimise disruption to essential public services, safeguard community wellbeing, protect our natural and public assets, promote economic stability and financial risk to government, including as insurer of last resort, ensure better government decisions that take account of future climate and the global transition to low emissions, and meet growing public expectations that governments will act to protect their livelihoods and incomes. The goal of climate ready government is that it will be business as usual by mid-2028. And just like the early days of workplace health and safety, It's a new and evolving area. It won't happen overnight, and it will require change in how agencies make their decisions and how they operate. So what is Climate Ready Government? The Climate Ready Government Initiative was approved by Cabinet in late 2024, and the primary mechanism is a Premier and Cabinet circular. Helpfully, we managed to get allocated PC 007. So it requires all agencies and their affiliated bodies to embed climate considerations in governance, manage climate risks, reduce carbon emissions, and report on their efforts annually. And while there are several key differences, these requirements broadly align with the requirements for climate-related disclosures that I mentioned, which have been introduced in the private sector under the Corporations Act, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with. Some of the more specific requirements include establishing agency roles and responsibilities for oversight and management of climate risks, opportunities, and emissions, ensuring adequate resourcing and access to training for staff, updating policies and strategic plans to be climate ready, assessing climate-related risks and opportunities and developing and implementing actions to address them, developing and implementing a carbon management plan for the agency, and then, as I mentioned, reporting annually on progress in implementing the circular. Now, on the face of it, it seems quite daunting. There is a lot to do, but generally most agencies will have staff already who are responsible for managing risk, managing assets and facilities with capabilities that can be built on. Climate Ready Government is also being rolled out in 3 phases. So the largest 4 agencies are first cabs off the rank. They're in phase 1. The bulk of state government agencies are in phase 2, so they've got a little bit longer to complete a lot of these activities. And phase 3 is the remaining sort of affiliated bodies, statutory authorities, those sorts of organisations. And it is worth noting that those affiliated bodies are expected to implement the circular as well, not just the main sort of agencies. It's also worth mentioning, while this is not directly part of the Premier and Cabinet circular, the Climate Change and Greenhouse Emissions Reduction Act was amended earlier this year to include a new clause that requires agencies to publicly report as part of their annual reports on what they are doing to manage climate change risks and reduce emissions. So there are some key differences with the sort of disclosures that you might be familiar with in the private sector. But it basically will provide an update for those agencies who are on sort of July to June reporting timeframes. The first report will come out for the 25-26 annual report. And it'll be a high-level summary of activities only. We'll do internal reporting that's much more detailed on the implementation of the circular. But we are certainly envisaging that over time, governments will be facing similar public disclosure requirements as the private sector is now seeing. Support is available. There are a range of different information sources and training that's available, and I encourage members here, if you are interested, please contact us and we can share those resources with you if you're interested in learning more about it or getting more information on some of the detail. This includes an online information hub, which is basically the source of the font of all knowledge, a community of practice that we do regular sessions around sort of general topics relating to either climate ready government or climate change more generally, guidance documents, templates, and introductory online training that sort of online modules that staff and yourselves can complete if they're interested. So in terms of audit and risk committees, obviously the roles and responsibilities that you'll have will vary depending on your agencies and how you want to work with them on the rollout of climate ready government. to help you get started, if you haven't already, we'd encourage you to communicate with your agencies about the initiative and consider what opportunities there might be for leadership and supporting change management within the agency. Ensure you're aware of the requirements of the circular and the Climate Change Act reporting if that's also relevant for you. Agencies will be working to establish governance mechanisms for climate ready government, which are due by the end of December. So hopefully most agencies would have already reached out to you, but if not, they should be sort of looking to finalise those arrangements fairly soon. So again, it'll be a discussion around what role your committees might play and how that might work within a governance structure for climate change risk management. You might want to review, as I mentioned, the introductory training modules available on the hub or joining the community of practice if you're interested. And supporting the development, just general supporting the development of an implementation plan for how agencies are going to roll out climate ready government within their operations over the next couple of years. As I mentioned, it is a change management process and we require support from you guys as leaders. And as you know, I don't know if this is anyone's particular area of interest, but the more support we can get and the more engagement from people like yourselves across agencies will really help sort of embed that change management in decision-making processes across government. So I'll just finish. Are there any questions or anything anyone would like to ask of me before I hand back to Andrew? Yeah. Yeah, we are in phase 2, so we have a little bit longer than the 4 main agencies that I mentioned. We've recently appointed a project manager to oversee the implementation, and I understand she is in the process at the moment of sort of working through what those governance arrangements might look like, and starting to put together a bit of a project plan for how we're going to implement it. So, yeah. Yes. Yeah, so we're currently, our climate science team is currently in the process of updating the projections with the latest projections data that's available. And we're expecting that to be released in February, March next year. So that guide will essentially be updated to, I think it's 2024 data. So hopefully, yeah, in the next couple of months, there'll be an updated version of that guide available. There's also an online map viewer, so you can go to the department's website and basically choose any location in South Australia, and you can choose your timeframes and which emissions scenarios you're interested in it. We'll visually map what the projected temperature or rainfall or fire days, I think it's got on there, are for that sort of regional location as well. So there's a couple of different sort of tools available. There is flood mapping available. Is that what you mean? Coastal? Yeah, so there is coastal flood mapping. I'm not super familiar with the details of it, but we do have a flood mapping tool as well that I think it's sort of fairly, I won't say unsophisticated, but it's relatively sort of straightforward to plot out again where you want to go and look at what the sea level rise might look like as well. Flooding impacts are, yeah. 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 Oh yeah, sure. I'll start with that one because I can reel that off the top of my head. So SA Water, Department for Infrastructure and Transport, SA Health, and Department of Education are the first 4 agencies. In terms of scenarios, we have currently left it up to agencies to nominate which scenarios they feel are appropriate for their own risk assessments. However, we strongly recommend going low and high. So generally out to 2050, if that's your chosen time frame. There's not a whole lot of variance between the scenarios. So, but if you're looking at, say, infrastructure with a long lifespan out to 2090 or 2070 or 2090, we're recommending you do at least a low and high. So yeah.
It's interesting because you said a lot work done.
Yeah, that's it. Be looking high, yeah. And I was going to say, we are considering, so our guidance was completed before the federal government sort of released their guidance for federal agencies on how to do this stuff. So we are looking at reviewing, particularly in light of the upcoming projections when they're updated and there is new data available, reviewing the guidance that we're giving agencies around which scenarios to use, yeah. That's it, yeah. But yeah, generally, yes, we tend to agree that higher is probably going to be more likely, and unfortunately, in terms of risk assessment, you are looking at worst case scenario, but it's worth knowing that. So yeah. Anyone else got any questions? No? Okay, Andrew, happy to stand back. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And this is an area of obviously growing interest and one that will continue to evolve. So I'm sure that we will see Sarah or someone from Sarah's group back here sometime in the future to update us on how things are going. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Daniel O'Donoghue, Deputy Auditor-General, who's going to talk to us about financial audit and some more specifics.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So I'm just going to talk to you primarily this morning about the outcomes from our financial audit process. So Sarah will talk a little bit about performance audit, but just focusing on our, I guess, what Andrew was saying earlier this morning about the core thing we have to do every year. We have to do the financial audits. We have to have an annual report, and in that report this year we had around 50 of our largest agencies, so it's about 90% of the government spending every year. That doesn't mean that the remaining agencies aren't important to us. They will be reported in an update report early next year. Most of the work for the 24-25 audits that had a 30 September deadline has been completed. There's a few things that I'll talk about in a second that are still going, but there are some that have later reporting deadlines that we're still working through, but the vast majority has been completed. There were 14 audits, so financial audit opinions that we modified this year. Now that's less than we had last year, so that's a good thing from our perspective. All of those modifications still relate to procurement reporting requirements. So this is in the Treasury accounting policy statements. There's a requirement to split spending between SA businesses and non-SA businesses. It's a particularly South Australian requirement. It is a challenge for a lot of agencies to meet that, even the ones who aren't qualified. There's a lot of work that goes into this this area. The caution I would have here is twofold. One, some of the agencies, or all of the agencies that were modified this year had modified opinions this year, had modified opinions last year as well. That's not to say they didn't put work in to try and address those issues. They have, but there's still a little bit more for them to do. In terms of the other cautionary part of this, Tier 2 agencies, so anyone who is not already doing this, does have to plan around this requirement from 26-27. Now, that sounds like a long time in theory. There's still a couple of years to work through that. It's not a long time to get the processes around this right. So it's very important if you're dealing with smaller agencies who are in that Tier 2 category to start thinking about it earlier rather than later, because it is something that is quite tricky to work through. There's not a system solution that will solve this for you. The other thing to say about the main outcomes, so the Department for Environment and Water was not in our annual report this year. Normally they are. Now, that's not to say that they didn't give us a set of statements on time. They did. We're working through the audit process. We are getting towards the end of that process, but I guess it's just something, a little bit of a reminder that we only have a very short window to do the audits in order to get our annual report out by the time that we have to do it. So if there are things that come up, it can mean that agencies miss out on that annual reporting timeframe. That's not something we would ever do lightly, and it's not something we're looking to do, but it can happen for varying reasons. This year, due unfortunately didn't make it in there, but it's something to think about in your planning, when you're working with your committees around things like asset revaluations, big things that change, or accounting policy changes coming in late in the year. Those sorts of things all require time for your agency staff to work through, and then the audit team to work through as well. So being really clear on what's coming up and when it's happening is a really useful thing in terms of that planning that year-end process. The other point I would make here is do provide a lot of services to a bunch of other entities, so landscape boards, a few others. Unfortunately, because of the nature of some of those services, they are very much intertwined with what Due does for itself. So if your agency is providing services to other entities, just be really clear on what those services are and what the impact of anything going wrong with them or any delays will be for other entities as well. We've been working through with Due and the other entities that are related. There's no issue there. It's just something to be aware of where you have an agency that is so central to a bunch of others. Just something to be aware of in that sort of annual reporting timeframe and process as well. Now, that's our financial statement audits. They're the independent opinions that we give to each agency. We also have a controls opinion, which we have to give for the whole of government. We haven't modified that opinion this year. There are some issues, which I'll talk about in a second, that are continuing in most cases, but there's no modification to that opinion, which is a good outcome, and that reflects that we have had access to information that we need. There's nothing that is so significant from all of the findings that we have that we felt the need to modify that opinion. In the past, it has been modified for issues with access to cabinet approvals, just around timing or access in general. That's working quite well for us, but to pick up on Andrew's point from earlier, where there are delays in other information, so not cabinet information at an agency level, that can delay some of the work and the conclusions and the outcomes for the controls opinion. Now, it's unlikely that a single contract at a single agency is going to be an issue for us from a controls opinion outcome perspective, but cumulatively, the earlier we get that stuff, the earlier we can work through it and conclude, the better for everyone. So it's just a little bit of a reminder about talking to your agencies around, what's their process for releasing information to the auditors? Do they have are there any particular hold-ups or issues that they have seen from their end? So in terms of the controls opinion, I guess the main themes from our controls opinion work, which is where we tend to find a lot of these issues, these themes are very similar, by which I mean almost identical to what they've been for the last couple of years. Which is, on the one hand, it's fairly predictable. These are the major sort of areas of government, government spending certainly, but it's also a little, I guess from our perspective, it's a little disappointing. Andrew's already talked about repeat issues, but there are some very clear themes to some of these things. Contract management and procurement, they're big areas across government. They are things where you would expect that there's a reasonable level of focus and attention at an agency level. So if I talk about contract management, just a little bit of context. We are not talking about small contracts with low value here generally. We are talking, when we're going out to do the audits, we're often picking very large contracts that are worth millions of dollars every year, or hundreds of millions in some cases. So if we're looking at that as part of an audit process and agencies are not meeting with their contractors, they're not having meetings to talk about how the contract is going and how it's being progressed against KPIs, they're not independently assessing those KPIs, we're not talking about a small risk here. this is a significant risk for those agencies in the delivery of their services to the public, as well as, are they getting value for money? The second point on there, documents are needed to help manage contracts. That's not really a shock. You need a contract management plan. It's a helpful thing to have. It's very, very helpful for your contract managers. Yet there's still instances where we go out and say, right, where's the contract management plan for this arrangement? And there isn't one. The other thing, because a lot of these arrangements do go for a number of years, people will change, people will move roles, new people come into agencies. So the people who are responsible for that contract management should have had training. Like, let's set them up to do the job well. So that's something that we continue to see doesn't always happen. Continuing with procurement, the first point is basic compliance with TIs and procurement SA requirements, still a thing that we find regularly. The second one, I guess I find surprising that we would start getting services from somebody before we have a contract in place. There's a whole bunch of risks that come with that. And yet it is still something that happens every year. We still find contracts where, no, they've started doing service. When was the contract signed? Oh, we're still working on that. Where does that leave you if something goes wrong in that start period? And also the bottom one, a lot of auditing, obviously we're looking at documentation. Part of that for contracts is around conflicts of interest. So we're dealing with the private sector, how are we managing any conflicts or perceived conflicts? Most of the time it's done really well, but there needs to be documentation to just support how that's been managed at an agency level. Now, speaking of large contracts, AGFMA, so the Across Government Facilities Management Arrangements, is a very large contract, and asset management in general. So these are areas where we, as part of our work, look to see and understand how agencies are managing those areas. Now, that's because we're talking about billions of dollars worth of assets. Having accurate information about them is a really good start. We still see issues with the level of information that agencies have to plan their activity around managing and replacing their assets. The second point I've got up there about where responsibility is outsourced, the risk isn't. So there have been issues that have come up in the last few years where there have been prosecutions. So SAPOL had one a few years ago, Department for Education has had one more recently, where there were maintenance failings that led to very poor outcomes for individuals. So that's the sort of risk we're talking about with asset management. Like, it's not just a theoretical thing that doesn't impact people. With AGFMA itself, there are still a lot of issues there. Department for Infrastructure and Transport is working through those issues, or they continue to work through those issues, I should say, across the government, but they do impact the effectiveness of that arrangement. Now, what that means for other agencies is thinking about how your agency can mitigate some of that impact, not just rely on what's happening centrally. Employee practices, so employee screening. So this is where you have an aged care check or a working with children check to undertake a particular role. We still do see some issues where that's not managed as well as it should be. Now, that's one where we look at a very small tolerance, in the sense of you have somebody working in a role who doesn't have that check, that's an issue. Doesn't have to be that there's multiple people doing it. So it's just one to think about if your agency has anyone in that sort of category where they have to meet a particular requirement. Instances very much like the contract arrangements where people start working without having a contract in place. So it's just, again, I guess one of those things of, if there's not one set up before that person arrives for their first day, you would expect that it would happen on the first day before they start work. That, oh, here's your contract, sign that, away we go. Some of them, I can't remember the exact time, but we're talking about they've been working for a couple of weeks before they've signed a contract, which is not a great practice to have. And the last point there around issues around the management of staff, about, how have they attended and completed their compulsory training to undertake their role? How well is that managed and reported so that you know what's happening with your agency staff? Just some payment process ones around things like making sure that your payment delegations are up to date. Checking the accuracy of payments before they're made, not making the payment and then working it out later. It's always easier to have the argument before you make the payment than after you've already given them the money and then trying to get it back. And the last one there around payments needing to be made at the right rates in the agreement. So this is about giving people access to the information they need to approve that. Yes, I know they provided the service, but is it at the right rate? Have they got the information that allows them to check that? So what worked well this year, just as a general overview from what we did, the Valuer-General worked with DTF and with us to a degree around coming up with some indices for asset valuations that agencies can use. They don't have to use them, but it's another tool that agencies have available to them to make that process smoother. Now, there were some challenges in how that was adopted. It wasn't a straightforward and simple process, but it was a change. But overall, that worked quite well. So that's something that has been good from this year. The number of issues we've had around procurement reporting has reduced as some of those processes have matured in agencies. And as I said earlier, some of those that we modified the opinion in the past are no longer modified. So challenges coming up. So I've talked about Tier 2 agencies. I'm going to say it again because I think it would be fair to say most Tier 2 agencies have ignored the procurement reporting requirement because they don't have to do it yet. That's perfectly understandable, but they need to start thinking about it now. The other one is the finance reform program. So this is the replacement of Masterpiece with Oracle. That starts from the 1st of December. So Department for Correctional Services is the first agency going across. That's happening the 1st of December. After that, there are rollouts for the next, couple of years through to the end of 2027. Every single one of those will be a significant amount of work for shared services and Treasury who are running that process, but also the agencies involved. So for this coming financial year, Correctional Services and the Department of Treasury and Finance and all of the agencies that are attached to it will be the ones who go through that process. And that's all I wanted to go through this morning. Has anyone got any questions out of any of that they would like to ask? Yes.
Daniel, the treasury and extraction,
Yep. Mm-hmm.
On being barracks and not getting nothing like that.
Yep.
You're seeing the 14 that are involved. Is there some advice for the Auditor-General as to how we can deal with this issue and not comply?
Sure. I'm going out on a limb and suggesting probably somewhere in health. Yep. So the Department for Health has taken a central approach to a lot of the information gathering. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, but they need to involve the LHNs in that process, and they need to be providing the information early enough that LHNs can go through it and make sure that it lines up with their records. They're happy that it's complete, because a lot of the contracting in health happens. There's some central work, but there's a lot that happens at individual LHNs as well. So it needs to be, probably, I think from our perspective, it needs to be more of a shared process to make sure that that happens. And also the approach that's been taken has been very heavily based on data, which is a great starting point. But what most other agencies have found is that that gives you the starting point, then you have to go further and understand what are the contract arrangements that sit under that. Unfortunately, I'd love to say there's a shortcut, but there isn't. For this, it's just something that needs a fair bit of work to work through what are the contract arrangements for each individual one, and that's probably the central thing that we have said to certainly to the Department of Health and Wellbeing. That's where they need to probably focus their work to improve. Anything else? Nope. In that case, I shall hand over to Salve Bianco, who will give us a little bit of a update on performance audit.
Hello, everybody. I'll be covering three things today. Just looking at the proton therapy project report and three quick takeaways from that we've got to bring to your attention. Some other recent reports, just briefly mentioning those that we've done recently, and then finally just having a quick overview of our upcoming reviews that we'll be doing. So first off, proton therapy project. So the proton therapy project, which I think is also referred to as SAMRI 2, it involves the commercial development of an office building with a purpose-built bunker to house a proton therapy system. The government had some involvement in this. They weren't the primary contractors. SAMRI were involved in acquiring the system. But our focus was to look at the state's involvement for this report and really summarise the project arrangements and the amount the state has spent, provide some information on the financial, legal and commercial and operational exposures for the state, and just some insights into how the SA government was managing its exposures and trying to bring out some observations about that. So that was the context for the report. It's a pretty lengthy report. I'm not going to be stepping through it, just to draw three things to your attention on that area. So the first one is complex projects in government. So government often get involved in complex projects that evolve over time. The financial legal exposures to government often changes over time, as does the risk profile that they're involved in. I suppose our observation there's a real need to stay on top of this and understand the emerging risks and exposures when you're involved in these sort of projects, and ensure those elements feed through to the governance decision-making and risk management arrangements, because they can span over a long time, multiple agencies involved, and you've got to stay on top of that, I think. But the second point was evidence to support key decisions. So often in these projects, it's imperative that decisions on significant matters and risks that will impact the project are well understood and analysed. Often decisions are made, we see very little documentation to support the analysis and in particular formal risk analysis. So the analysis should be provided to the decision maker, and the rationale for the decision should also be documented. So that's an observation we have in government. And I think the documentation does provide the evidence base that supports the use of public monies. The other thing to mention with that is that when risks are identified and you pick up mitigation strategies, they should be documented, monitored and regularly reported to decision makers so that you're staying on top of that. And that's often difficult to do with an evolving project, but it's something to put attention to. And finally, once again, for these sort of projects when multiple agencies are involved and you need to pay extra attention just to make sure the governance and risk arrangements are formally established and maintained. So without going through the detail again, some of the things we talked about in our report were, project management plans, how the project steering committee is functioning, is it's continuing to meet, risk management plans, are they up to date risk registers, and are you regularly reporting to decision makers on risks? So that's just a quick snapshot in the brief time I have. Just some other reports I'll very briefly mention as well that we've produced recently. So our contract management and local government, as Andrew mentioned, that came out in June 2025. So we looked at 2 councils and whether they're effectively managing their contracts. And it was a focused review. We looked at particular areas. It didn't cover all contract management activity. We did have a look at how they're managing contract risks and contract management risks, how they're managing contractor performance and key contractual requirements, and how they're managing contract extensions and variations. And I think Daniel had a slide up there. I think the sort of observations aren't that dissimilar to what's coming up in state government. But what we did do in our report, we tried to pull out some insights on contract management that all agencies could consider. So in our report, that's at Appendix 4, and it did cover a range of things like managing risks, assigning responsibility to staff, training, monitoring and evaluation, those sort of things. So that's available in our appendix. And Appendix 5 also gives you some further information on contract management activities, as what the key activities are and what policies and procedures should ordinarily cover. And if you don't want to read our report, you see we produced a separate insights document, only 2 pages, and it's on our website alongside our report. And it sometimes can be an easy reference point. It's probably worth plugging that we are attempting to make our reports more accessible. And for example, with this one, you've got a smorgasbord of choices. You can read our insights, our one-page snapshot. You can have a look at our exec summary. You can look at our appendices, or you can just go to the insights document. Our other report we've produced recently was Aboriginal Education Strategy in August 2025. And we had a look there whether the Department for Education was effectively managing the Aboriginal Education Strategy 19 to 29. to deliver its intended outcomes. Our audit focus on stage 2 of their strategy. This is another review that covers project management that we've done over a series of 2 or 3 years. And we did have some observations about effectiveness of key processes, such as your planning, the implementation strategy, performance measures and data collection, monitoring, reporting on the progress, and evaluating the strategy implementation and outcomes. And these observations are probably similar to things that have come up in our previous reviews. So, for example, we've done stuff on homelessness services and gambling harm minimisation, access to mental health services. So from our point of view, we look at that body of work we've done. I suppose what we bring out of that is an agency needs to have these processes operating effectively to be able to demonstrate the impact of the program it delivers and whether it's progressing towards achieving its goals and objectives. That was probably an overall observation we had from the body of work we've done. And just very quickly, in the time remaining, a couple of reviews that we're doing at the moment. First one was River Torrens to Darlington project. So once again, we're not reviewing the whole project, so it's an enormous $15 billion project. But what we're focusing on is whether DIT has effective arrangements for managing its risks and issues related to delivering the project main works under its project alliance agreement. The audit is focusing on risks and issues in key areas such as project scope, scheduling, costs and quality. And it would include coverage of things like governance arrangements, arrangements to identify, analyse and evaluate risks and issues, and processes to treat risks and issues. So that's currently in train and we're looking to table sometime next year. And then finally, we're also doing a review on management of food safety. And the review will cover 2 councils and also the Department of Health and Wellbeing. And that's because both levels of government have a role in food safety in this state. So it's looking at the regulation of how that works and the management of it. And for the councils, we're looking at whether they have effective regulatory and other activities to ensure food businesses provide safe and suitable food. And so the audit will cover things like governance arrangements, monitoring and assessing compliance with food laws, and assistance to help food businesses understand food safety laws. For the department, slightly different focus, Department of Health and Wellbeing. We're looking to cover the food safety framework they've established, the processes to appoint and approve qualified food safety auditors, and processes to collect data from councils. And once again, that review is in train at the moment, and we're looking to table next year as well. So I think that covers my bit of the discussions. Is there any questions? Okay, I will ask Andrew Corrigan to come and present.
Okay, I was kind of hoping Self would be over time, so I didn't have to present, but we'll see how it goes. Okay, this is an update for my section, which is data and technology. So all the things I'm talking about today will essentially are taken from the Part A of our audit annual report, the executive summary. So the first thing I want to briefly talk about is IT-General controls. Our IT audit team conduct testing every year, mainly over the key financial systems of government, especially shared services because they impact so many different agencies. This is the slide up there is pretty much a summation of the things that we find. As you'll notice, user access management seems to be a key issue that we find, and we find it every year. Now, some of the commentary of individual agencies are embedded within the Part C of our annual report, but this is just a summation. So I would certainly encourage, from an audit risk committee perspective, a lot of these things are just kind of bread and butter IT stuff that really should be addressed. User access management, in particular, management of privileged users really need to be onboarding and offboarding needs to be done in a prompt manner because it creates a number of risks if user accounts, for example, are left active when people have left the organisation. So I don't necessarily need to go into each individual one, but I would encourage because a lot of these issues really are occurring, is the Audit Risk Committee to understand where their agency is at in terms of the IT general controls, and if they're getting these ongoing issues, what's the underlying reason for that occurring. The next one is on legacy systems. So we do mention legacy systems in the Part A of the report, but basically what I'm trying to say in that bit of commentary was that we're in the process of doing a follow-up review of legacy systems. We did a report in 2018-19. What we're currently doing is we went out and surveyed 18 agencies in terms of how they're tracking in terms of what their environment is, what legacy systems do they have, do they have plans to replace them, how are they managing those risks, etc. So, and then we've now drilled down to 10 agencies where we're looking in a lot more detail. Now, from Audit Risk Committee perspective, it would be good if agencies are letting you know what legacy systems they have in their environment, that they should, where possible, have plans to replace those legacy systems. We understand that that's not always easy to do. It's not always feasible because there are in some cases, large costs associated with replacing these systems. But where possible, they should have plans to replace them. And most importantly, if they don't have plans to replace them, or even if they do, many of these replacing legacy systems can take several years. They should have the risk managed in the interim. So they should have, you should know exactly what systems you got out there and which ones are legacy. You should know the associated risks while they're in operation. And those risks should be documented in a risk register. The risk should be mitigated where possible in terms of should have a range of mitigating controls, and the risk should be tolerable. And from an Audit Risk Committee perspective, you should be receiving some sort of regular report on what you've got, what the risks are, and how they're managing those risks. So that is what we are recommending to agencies. If we're finding legacy systems, okay, do you have plans to replace them? Do you have funding? If not, are you going to avenues such as the digital investment fund to try and assist with that funding? And are you managing those risks? So that report should be out in 2026. There are obviously legacy systems out there, so but I'd encourage every Audit Risk Committee to be having that as one of their focuses when they look at IT controls. Okay, the other part of commentary our section did was on artificial intelligence. So what we did, we went out and sent out letters to 23 different agencies, and that was just to get an understanding of if they're using AI, what are they using it for, and also what are their plans in the future and over the next couple of years. So I'm not going to read out every component, but the slide that's up on the screen, hopefully, yep. That kind of summarizes some of the key things that agencies are using AI for. In essence, to try and obviously improve efficiencies, hopefully to get better outcomes. Now, so that was a kind of an oversight of some of the things that agencies use it for. The report in Part A, we looked at, I also then highlighted 3 specific agencies, was SA Water, SAPOL, and Education. As some probably some exemplars of what some of the agencies are using AI for. In particular, I think Education with EdChat are doing it's very innovative in what they're doing and should be commended. Okay, so in terms of the Audit Risk Committee, this slide, and it's taken straight out of the report, so I'd encourage you, it's only 4 or 5 pages in terms of the overarching commentary on AI. Artificial intelligence has some potential real benefits to agencies in terms of creating efficiencies, but it also has a number of risks. Now, the OCO has issued some guidelines in terms of artificial intelligence. in terms of making sure that, that what type of data the AI system is using, the logic of the AI system, ethics, making sure there's no breach of copyright, things like that. So I would encourage all agencies to have an AI policy. In fact, it's mandated by the cybersecurity framework. I would use OCIO's guidance as a really, really good starting point. They've also recently issued some guidance on AI and ethics, which I also found really interesting. And I didn't disagree with anything they wrote. It was fairly practical information about how agencies should be managing AI as they introduce it. From an audit risk committee perspective, I would encourage that if your agencies are introducing AI applications, or they're using Copilot, for example, which many agencies are starting to use, that they have obviously a policy surrounding how they should use it. They have a clear understanding of the data that the AI system is ingesting, whether the data is accurate, correct. The logic of the AI system, and whether it's hopefully removing biases when it actually does its job. And there should be regular monitoring and regular testing to make sure that what it's meant to do is what it's actually doing, the AI system. So we've summarized in a table some of the oversight mechanisms that agencies should have in place as they're adopting AI. Wherein our agency, for example, is in the process of looking at Copilot. We do have a pilot, so we do have a policy. We're trying to understand how it works. It does some fantastic things, but it also does some very interesting things and a lot of agencies that are using Copilot are having the same sort of experiences where it can create some efficiencies, but it also has some inaccuracies where the logic may not be right, it may not, or as the user may not be putting sufficient prompts in the system so that they're not getting good output. So AI systems do have some benefits, but all agencies and the Audit Risk Committee should be aware of some of the challenges and some of the deficiencies they may have. And next one. So I just thought I'd rush through it because I was hoping for some questions on AI, because a lot of agencies are using AI in terms of, most agencies, OCIO has a program in place in relation to Copilot. So not every user will have Copilot, but a lot of users have been given licenses. So how they use it and their controls around it are really important. So
yeah, put the question in relation to understanding the exposure of policies that need to be got from into the AI environment.
That's good.
Summary, understanding that once you allow AI access to it, generally, it's into the ether. Potentially also a closed system.
That's correct. Yeah. So when before we put out Copilot, rolled Copilot out into our office, for example, we did do a detailed risk assessment, and we also have limited what Copilot can do. So there is a web mode and a work mode. So we made sure that in the web mode, it couldn't access Microsoft 365 data. So, but we are finding, well, I use it on a daily basis, but I do find sometimes it's really good for summarizing documents, but I've found it struggles with really large Excel files. It gives some really strange results. It also struggles with diagrams. It can really summarize documents well, and it can create tables, and I've used it to create Power BI dashboards and things like that. But it can just give some very strange results in trying to interpret diagrams and things like that. So, but in terms of your question about what it can access, agencies who are using Copilot, it will be able to access all their Microsoft 365 environments, but it's meant to be only using the permissions that the user would normally have. So if the user is running a Copilot, using Copilot and putting in a prompt request, it should only be having access to the data that they would normally have, which from a security perspective is good, but then it may not also be giving a totally accurate response, because if you don't have sufficient data, it's not necessarily going to give you a sufficient and accurate response. So I've actually, we've been trialing Copilot. We've had some really good successes in it, but there are certainly some challenges. And knowing what data can be ingested is a key challenge that all agencies should be making sure that it's only grabbing data that it's meant to grab. And certainly confidential data should be touching. So, excellent. Okay.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm sure there'll be more questions, if not today, in the future as we progress along this interesting AI stream. We're running about 5 minutes late for morning tea, so morning tea will be held out in the foyer. My schedule said we'd be back at 11. I don't think that gives us enough time, so I think we'll probably try and head back in here about 11:05, 11:10, at which stage we'll have Michael Pinglis from Shared Services, who is our second guest speaker for the day. And then after Michael, we'll open up the floor to further questions, because I know that there may be other questions. Also, if you want to take the opportunity to grab myself or any of our executive out in the foyer for questions you may have that arose from this morning's session, feel free to do that as well. Okay, enjoy your morning tea.
So we are happy to have Michael Pinglis with us this morning from Shared Services. As you know, Shared Services do a lot of work across government. So Michael has been with Shared Services in the Director of Payroll Services area since June 2024, I think. Started a long time ago as a graduate, not as long as some other people like myself, but close, and has been overseas, obviously, in the UK and Switzerland, as it says on the slide there, in investment banking in the past. So he's got a lot of experience. He's been kind enough to join us today because others have other things that they need to do for DTF today. So please join me in welcoming Michael to just give us an update.
Yeah, another click. Let's click the middle one. Yep. Morning, everyone. Oh, morning. Yes, still morning. Morning, everyone. Expect to see the photo so big. So thanks, Daniel. Thanks for the intro and thanks for having me. I'm going to touch on probably a little bit of introduction to Shared Services. I'm not sure the knowledge that people have of the business. I'm then going to look at the control environment and how we attest to our level of controls that we have across the different lines of our business. I'll touch on some sort of topical, I suppose, control incidents that are ongoing or have been happening over the last year, and how we've looked at them and dealt with them. I'll talk about our overall level of control effectiveness. And then I'll touch on what I hope is interesting topic around some transformation that's happening in payroll in my part of the business, which is, transformative for what we do and is going to enable a lot of different things. So I hope that's of interest. And happy to take questions. As I said, I'm here. Mark Carey is my boss, and he's got something else on this morning. So I'll do my best to answer those. If it's a different line of business and I don't feel comfortable offering up an opinion, I'll certainly take those on notice. Here we are. Look, before I go into the slides, I mean, just a bit of context around Shared Services. 600 staff. I think we're the biggest branch in DTF. We have 3 major lines of business. So we have payroll services and work injury services. So we do have we do a lot of work injury management for different agencies, those that don't have their own injury management function. We have financial services, which is principally accounts payable, accounts receivable, and we have financial accounting. So in terms of stats, I don't want to bombard you with them, but I thought it'd be good just to give a little bit of context to the business and put our control environment sort of in that perspective. So there's 3 million pays that we do every year across 120,000 employees. It's a 52-week-a-year operation, certainly in payroll. People are peculiarly interested in getting their pay around Christmas time, so we don't get to take that time off. We're having a real downtime across that period. Accounts payable pay close to $18 billion worth of invoices. That's probably over $3 million separate invoices in a year. We pay in payroll around $11 billion in salary every year. And in financial accounting, they prepare, I think it's almost 180 sets of financial statements. So, beyond the financial statements, there is a lot of money moving in and out of the business. And we are custodians of some whole of government systems that manage and, ensure the money goes where it's supposed to, it's sort of wasn't going to bombard you in stats and then precisely went and did that. But it's a big business, 600 staff, 300 just in payroll. And in a little while, I'll probably give you some context as to why we have so many staff and, and what they do day to day. But I'll move into the slides proper. So it's a little small. We are, as it says there, a key financial services provider across government, and we need to ensure an effective control environment across those systems and processes that we manage. We have the key documents there that we are governed by. But in terms of how we assess those level of controls, that's done by a range of different activities. We obviously have internal and external audit activities. That 24-25 DTF internal audit has kicked off just in the last week. I met with the DTF internal audit team to kick that process off. We have a department-wide strategic risk register that we need to assure alignment to, or if we feel there's a big enough risk, add to that. Within shared services, we have each line of business. So myself in payroll, financial services, and then financial accounting, we do a twice annual review of operational risk register. Our environment is changing, often and rapidly, and we need to make sure that our the risks are identified appropriately. That our control activities are reasonable and appropriate, and then the level of risk we have post those controls, or the residual risk, is deemed effective, or where it's not, a pathway to bring it to effective. So that's a key part of our risk management tool. We do use external companies to do cybersecurity reviews. They're both scheduled and where we feel there's an incident or something that requires a certain level of attention. We have two horizontal lines of shared services, from a shared service to us. We have business performance, and they run our sort of BAU compliance framework with a range of different risk and compliance activities that we as business leaders have to attest to on a monthly basis. We also have our business systems team, which manage the relationships with the vendors and run the support for all the key systems that we manage. Probably the key one for a lot of people here would be Basware, which is the expense management invoice system. And then the last thing in the mix is probably an incident complaint review. I know I get a lot of complaints in payroll, but when we do have an incident, we like to do full reviews of those and make sure if there are learnings to take, we can take them out. I think they are really illustrative sometimes of where we may have gaps. And they can be anything from issues with our HRMS system, so our payroll, our payroll system. It could be anything to our banking system. We moved from whole government banking provider last year to ANZ, which has not been without its complications, like any major change. And that's still, the remnants of that is still going, which some agencies will be experiencing now. Even it's moved towards even the retail side of some businesses, point of sale type stuff. So that's tailing off, but though having a new banking provider can be significant. We've got one line of code that's dodgy, or one line of data that's incorrect in a file might put at risk 5,000 to 10,000 nurses or teachers not being paid. So we tend to have really good established crisis management and escalation protocols for those types of situations. We try to learn a lot off the back of those incidents. Complaints can sometimes be a little bit less helpful in terms of in terms of identifying risk, because a lot of them just come down to often accuracy or timeliness of people's pay or leave balances or something like that. And, it's sometimes tough to disseminate the disgruntled type clients versus, things where we can actually take major learnings from. But we do have a incident and complaint matrix and dashboard, which we constantly review. That's the mix of different things we use. Before I get onto our actual assurance around our controls, and I'll touch on these a little bit deeper in the next slide. Key control issues for last year. The fraud threat actor environment is persistent and constant, particularly in accounts payable. We have ongoing impersonation attempts, regularly. And generally we have the controls in place to identify and report those and mitigate those, I think. Classic way to do it is to create a very similar domain or website or something as a legitimate vendor, put in a fake invoice that looks very similar. Like with the volume of paperwork that comes through that part of the business, it's difficult to always know if that's a legitimate vendor, and you're at risk of, and we've seen it, incorrect, valid, legitimate bank accounts attached to a fraudulent vendor. The money's out the door and gone, right? And it's lost. So, that's where we have a lot of risk. And we had one fraud incident last year. That's down from 2 in 23-24. And what we're trying to do in response to that is work on a better way for the agencies and our staff to verify those vendors, and get a better guide for the agency staff to actually come in and, when they're creating vendors, what kind of checks they have to ensure that those vendors are legitimate. We're adding vendors by the thousands, and they span from, a mum and dad type operation through to major contractors, obviously, right? You look at all the projects we do in infrastructure work, so they all need to be treated essentially the same. So that's the control environment, and I think, that's the environment that we work in. You add to other complexities from a change perspective or the activity that's happening. From payroll perspective, we're very rapidly changing and busy industrial landscape. There's these things are all in the news. We currently have the salaried officers EA out for negotiation, which is there's been some stop work activity and things like that. We've got allied health professionals have just had a brand new EA created that was spun out of the salaried officers enterprise agreement. The medical officers has just been ratified and done by SAIT. And off the back of that, we have a lot of activity to update our payroll systems, update our codes, back pay to where the industrial determination goes back to, and update new pay rates and all those types of things. And then the nursing EA is coming, and then we have some weekly paid workers, which can be anyone from gardeners to plumbers. That just sort of adds to the level of complexity. So within my team of 300, I don't just have processing staff. I have a team advice and strategy that provide advice to agencies, interpretation of industrial awards, looking at awards versus agreements. There's a lot of complexity in that. And then as Daniel touched on, FRP is huge. That's, a generational transformation project across government. And the impact on payroll is relatively low, but across the other parts of the business, it's huge. Mark Carey, the head of shared services, is heavily involved with FRP as well. And I spoke to the program director last week. They're all absolutely under the pump to make that December 1st go live for corrections, and very exciting. But obviously that brings with it a level of risk as well. And from a shared services perspective, and we'll obviously be maintaining 2 financial management systems. We'll have Masterpiece for some agencies, and then as we go live, we'll be in this situation where we're running parallel systems. So that's adds to the complexity and the challenges. So in terms of assessing our control effectiveness, it's not it's not exact science necessarily. I think it's a mixture of those things, and then it's a judgment call essentially on the balance of reasonableness across those different activities and results off the back of those activities, as to whether or not we think that our control levels are effective. One incident is not like the other, obviously, and one control finding can be completely different. They go from low to critical, obviously. And really, it's just Mark in his letter to Tammy, to the Under Treasurer, once a year, testing to our control environment is really a result of that, right? And agencies can challenge that, our assurance around what the level is, and we'll be obviously happy to have that discussion. But it's really around based on that. Look at the fraud, for example, right? One fraud incident, we have solid controls around it. We're developing strategies to help improve how we onboard vendors and manage them. And we consider that effective. And as you can see at the bottom there, Mark's attestation to the Under Treasurer was that across all four parts of the business, we do have effective controls. It's just as I said, it's not, we don't spit all these things into a big calculator and then come out with an effective or a partially effective rating. It's just really on the balance of probabilities. Do we consider that effective? And that's what Mark tests to. All right. So, as I said, we manage whole of government systems. We're a key financial service provider, and it's really, in terms of that effectiveness, it's in the context of material impact on completeness or accuracy of public authority financial statements. And if we feel there is no material impact, we consider our control environment effective. When I look at the different lines of the business, payroll, our main issue, and I'll get to why, is sometimes being able to find things. When we do it, when our audits, particularly our DTF audit, we often, or at times, have not been able to find the sampling requests. We do have it. It's just actually locating the physical paperwork. And I'm going to talk about that in a second in terms of what we're doing to address that challenge. And look, we're not launching a big transformation initiative necessarily to address the audit challenge, but it will certainly be a benefit of doing it. And that's around digitising how we work. The other findings are relatively minor, and I won't necessarily drill down too far into them. Most of them relate to minor security or access issues in our major systems, all rated as low. But we are constantly looking at annual upgrades we have to our payroll system, and that's scheduled for later in the year, which does deal with some of those control findings, as well as adding functionality in different modules into CRIS 21. From a financial services perspective, there's been weaknesses in the manual payment process, and we've addressed that with changing the form, changing the process, and long term, off the back of FRP, that'll all be moved electronically and done out of ServiceNow. So what we are trying to do in shared services is leverage ServiceNow as a sort of one-stop shop for customers and clients to come and do a range of different things. In payroll, we just moved from a legacy customer service tool into a ServiceNow-based tool. And that's a way for people to not have to phone or email, actually drive there through it. There's a portal available for people with a knowledge library and all these types of things. So we're trying to look at a modernisation approach to payroll, both to benefit how we run the business, but also to address some control things. I mentioned before the vendor issues, and we're looking at a verification guide, which is coming out in the next few months, I believe, and education as well to our staff. We constantly need to educate our staff around the range of threats that we have and ensure that training's up to date, procedures up to date, etc., and retain the staff as well. The other issue that's probably worth mentioning is Basware. There's a potential upload issue with getting malicious files into the system. Basware, again, as a vendor, are constantly looking at patches and upgrades to help prevent those things. I mean, as I said, it's $18 billion of payments that go through that system. So they loaded a couple of months ago a new malware scanning in response to that finding. Financial accounting, look, that they don't really have many control issues that have been identified in the last 12 months. there's some unencrypted channels for file transfers between us and Masterpiece, and we're looking at exploring options to bring in a secure protocol for that transfer in the coming months. And obviously FRP complicates that as well. We can't neglect Masterpiece and the challenges we have around that just because Oracle is coming through FRP. And as I said, there's a challenge of balancing two systems. All right, so that's probably a summation of what's happening. Look, I'm very, very confident as director of payroll of our controls. And the team and the experience and knowledge in the team to deal with the threats. And I can speak for Richard as the financial services director and Steve, financial accounting, that they're also confident. But there is a need to be vigilant and active as the environment does change rapidly, and that's just something we do deal with daily. All right. So as I said before, I went to the private sector 20 years between being a graduate and my current role, and I did get paper shock when I started at payroll. Payroll services, for those who don't know, is entirely paper based. There's nothing. We do have some automation in some of the agencies, but in terms of how we process payroll information through payroll services is entirely paper based. So I have a team monitoring printers. We have every agency, 70 plus agencies have an email inbox, and we print, batch, and move physically around the building, 7 floors of Wakefield House with trolleys, pieces of paper. So anyone that's ever sent in and everyone's had a contract change, their hours changed, a leave request, timesheet, that's gone through that process, right? And it's probably overdue to address that. It's been attempted for probably a decade, I think, and we've managed to get the funding to do it. So we have a vendor in place to to actually enable us to digitize the workflow. If I look at the actual project, we have a pilot due in December as well, a week after FRP go live. And that's with 3 different agencies. We wanted to capture a range of different processes and forms. So we have one health agency, which is Women's and Children's, Department of Human Services as well. And then what we generally always do, we put our own agency into these pilots as well. So we have DTF, and then we have 3 more deployments, and we expect to have the project completed by June 26. So if I go to the bottom, I know it's a little small, but that's just our standard workflow. Clients email us forms. We have a work management team, as I said, that monitor the printers. I think we're the biggest paper purchaser in Australia, from my understanding. We have three massive printers. We have a Fujitsu technician sort of on retainer at this point, and they're printed and distributed to the teams, and then the processor takes the form and enters it into the payroll system manually on the screen. We have a QA process. We sample different rates of things depending on what they are, and we do checks on those. And then depending on any rework, it then gets sent for physical storage. I think we keep Iron Mountain in business, to be honest. We have a number of storage boxes worth of paper created every day. So that process, and I want to be clear, it does work. It's not, I think people get shocked when new starters come in and look at the amount of paper that moves through. Like, the vast majority of people get paid on time and correctly. Now, there's a 99% performance across 120,000 employees means probably, there's always some employees who there is an issue, but generally our performance is really good. So we've got to be really careful that to improve the business, we don't put at risk the things we're actually doing well. But what we essentially want to do is, we're not really changing the fact that we manually input things into the payroll systems. We still have to do that, but it's just done from a screen. So work management transforms a little bit into, we have a tool called Tungsten Total Agility, which we have internally named Payflow. That can read documents, assess what it is, and immediately batch it and queue it to the correct team based on the agency. And then our payroll data input teams, that they'll have that put into their personal queue, and we have obviously work allocation, all those types of things, but then they can enter it still manually, but from screen to screen. And then we have a electronic QA process. And then one of the big things is that we're going to then, we'll have an API at the back end of that to linking the Tungsten solution into Objective, which is the DTF electronic document and records management system. So when audit comes calling next time, we don't have to call Iron Mountain and trawl through boxes of paper. We will have, as we store it into Objective, we strip out 4 or 5 pieces of metadata from each thing, and every single employee in government will have obviously has an employee ID, and we can search for anything immediately. We can't retrospectively do it, obviously, but moving forward, a much more secure and better solution for how we find documents. So in terms of benefits, they're pretty vast, to be honest, and from an agency perspective, it can take 24 to 48 hours for a piece of paper to get from the inbox to a processor to actually do the work. And we have a 10-day SLA, so that can go from 2 days to instant. So we can get better performance around actually processing pays. As I said, better records management, so we can find employee information quickly. And again, as I said, better compliance with internal audit. We can get better reporting to agency. Push back a little bit on SLAs and sort of say, hey, actually, 20% of your documents have been late. So we're a little bit at the bottom end of the chain at sometimes. So we do have an SLA, and we need to sort of enforce that at times as well, and sort of giving better data around that will be helpful. We'll obviously save a lot of money. Obviously replacing some of that with a vendor, but we will not have the risk around printing and the cost around printing and paper. The 2 big ones for me internally, I suppose, are flexible working options for my staff. I have 300 staff, 200 of which are ISO 2s and 3s, and having to be physically in the office because of the paper, can be a deterrent for a lot of people in the work from home kind of environment. So we can't compete with other agencies where that's a benefit that people see. So that'll be really good that we can actually start to offer that to our staff with obviously the right controls in place around that. And the big one for me in terms of transforming the business is that digitizing enables lots of future automation. As I said, we're not really changing the work we're actually doing because we still have, instead of looking at a piece of paper and typing it in, not that I've ever done it, but I've watched people do it, we're going to be doing that from screen to screen. Obviously, that enables a lot of things in the context of robotics, context of AI. We've done a couple of pilots on a few different little bits and pieces. I know DTF are looking at different robotics tools, and if we do have really repeatable processes, and this is not about obviously headcount or anything like that, it's just about better accuracy and better controls. And I would rather have, instead of someone entering data, I'd rather have more checking and more assurance around what we actually do. So hugely transformative, as I said, for us. It's been a really well-run project. It took us a little time to get the vendor selected. AP use the same vendor to do their invoice workflow management as well. We're just building a lot on the functionality that they have, handwriting recognition, these types of things. You'll be amazed at how doctors fill in their timesheets. So it's going to be transformative for us, but it's really about the next phase as well and what that enables. So I'm really excited about it. It's been, for me, it's been 18 months, but for a lot of my staff, and I have a lot of long-term staff in the business who are very passionate and dedicated about, government service and payroll service. For them, it's a real game changer. So I'm really excited about the pilot coming in a month or so. And my last slide is just a little bit of levity. So these are 2 of my work management team. That is 1 week's amount of paper that we print out in the business. We print 3.5 million pieces of paper every year, 8 meters of records a week, 72,000 pieces of paper. So it does put into context. I think really that I'm proud of what we do deliver across all. Like I said, we essentially every government agency and every government employee. It does work, but it's time for a change, and I'm excited about it. So look, that's what I wanted to cover today. I want to give you a little bit of context around shared services. comfort around the control environment, and assurance, I suppose, that we are aware of threats and we have a really good control environment and framework to deal with those. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions. Oh, there's one over here.
Todd?
Really interested in the bona fide process. Do you see that changing in terms of automation system in the bona fide process? And then we also develop projects start maybe in the process. Do you see that changing? Or is that still going to be available to every project? Do I see obligation of the agencies to do your own bona fide? Well, the noise is say it's too hard.
To be fair to Michael, Todd, that's not a shared services issue. Whilst they generate the bona fides off the payroll system, the actual conduct of that control is an agency issue, not a shared services issue.
So it is a hand thing. But it's not a fixed thing. I'm sure I would know that I'm not. Don't have it as a company. Yeah, that endorse it. There's been nothing, I've not seen any functionality from the other nothing. Something like that. It's just very so we could be
Cool. Thank you, Michael. Thank you for your glimpse inside the black box that is shared services. As it turns out, what's inside the black box is actually paper. So, okay. Some quick thank yous before I let you go, and obviously I will cut to questions. Thank you to the Audit Office team who put this together, particularly Alison, Julie, Clayton. Great work in putting this together again. Thank you for your attendance and your attention through this morning. It's been wonderful again. Some things I picked up out in the coffee space. A couple of people asked questions about the climate change reporting, and clearly people are on audit risk committees who have exposure to Corps Act entities who know that it's coming in for financial statements. That's not the case here at the moment. So what you were talking about is a requirement for annual reports only, not the actual financial statements. Our experience or our understanding in South Australia is we only have one SA Government Corps Act entity that is required to do that Corps Act style reporting, and that's Adelaide Oval Stadium Management Authority. So unless you're on the ARC for that entity, you don't have to worry about that at this stage. of course, it is open to government with COP31 coming to try and roll that into financial statements, but we haven't heard that at this stage. The other thing, a lot of talk about AI this morning. What we are going to do is roll that information that's in Part A into a simplified release, which will go on our Insights page, so that that information is more readily available. So we'll be doing that, and I'd be interested to hear if there's other information that's in our reports that you would like to see in that sort of insight space as well. We're really trying to use that insight space as much as we can to share with ARC chairs, the committee staff, committee members, etc. Other than that, happy to take questions if there are questions from earlier. Otherwise, we'll give you it's not really an early minute. I'll make out it's an early minute. Questions? Otherwise, thank you for your attendance. It is close enough to Christmas. I walked past the Christmas tree on the way here to wish you a Merry Christmas. Safe New Year. Thank you very much for your attendance.